Yes. Okay.
Can I tell you just real quick? I kind of told Charlie this, but we got here this morning. The computer cuts on and it says, upgrade to Windows 11 right now. And it doesn't give you a choice. I can't click on anything. And the last thing you want is an update going on while you're doing this. And I finally think I got that paused. And I start Zoom and it says, updating Zoom. And so I don't know what's going to happen this morning. And sure enough, Zoom starts and we're about this wide and about this tall. We look like, some kind of weird alien. So, this is almost a full-time job. And still, even if you test it during the week, you show up on Sunday morning and they're saying, oh, by the way, we're changing everything. So surprise. I think we got it all under control.
So we're going to do the book of Ruth, and I'm not sure how many weeks. The book of Ruth only has four chapters. And one of the people that Scott follows, who's a Messianic Jew, which means he is a Jewish person by heritage, but believes in Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior. And he's a theologian, I guess the best way to say it, but Scott was reading his stuff and he says, Mary, he spent 3 weeks on the first chapter of Ruth. So Scott told me I can't have a timeline. Scott forwarded an introduction and background to the book of Ruth, and we're not going to repeat the whole thing, but I know some people don't have a chance during the week. But I want Scott to touch base before we give some history on the book of Ruth, just to give the contrast between Ruth and Esther, since we just finished Esther.
When did you decide I was going to do that?
Right now.
And maybe that's what it's worth. The sheet, if you get a chance to read it.
Yeah.
But the idea that we just got done with Esther, and she was a Jew living among Gentiles, and Ruth winds up being a Gentile who goes to live among the Jews. And there's a lot more in that paragraph that I wrote. But the big thing is, you get down to the bottom, and we see in Esther all of the dark side of people, all of the cruelty that's possible when Haman wants to annihilate a whole group of people, and we see all this struggle. And then we flip over to Ruth, and it's this story of goodness. The goodness of people to other people. But in both of those, we see this story, this evidence that God takes care of his people. And at times when it seems almost hopeless, like, in the movie where it looks like, or the TV show, it looks like the heroes are finally up against it and there's nothing that'll help. And then there's this turn of events. What I said last time in Esther in Hebrew is called hafak. It is this turnaround, and God takes care of his people. And we see that in both of these in some pretty amazing ways.
So if you have a chance, I did forward that earlier in the week, and it's the introduction and background to the book of Ruth, and it's got some fun facts. So when we start the Ruth, what took place, we'll see in the first verse when we read it that it took place in the time of Judges, but it is believed that, which would have been about 1100 BC, okay? So this took place before David was king, because this is in the time of the Judges, and it probably took place when Gideon was a judge. So let's just say, and Scott doesn't like when I do timelines, but it's 1100 BC, just to give an idea. But it wasn't written down to either 900 to 600 BC. So, 200 to 500 years later, it was written down. And we were talking about that this week, and the best example, when we did the Christmas, about the characters in Christmas, we talked about and showed the movie The Nativity. If you guys remember the scene where Mary is a young girl and she's going into this woman to help, and she ends up serving treats, and you say it.
And it's an older woman, and the women taught the children until they got up to, the age where they were considered adults at like 12. But the women we're always the teachers of the young. And this woman is teaching the kids, and she says, there was a great wind, and all the children say, but the Lord wasn't in the wind. And there was a fire, and all the children say, but the Lord wasn't in the fire. And all the children say, a still small voice, and they knew it by heart, by rote. These stories were carried down orally for this one for quite
Hundreds
some
of
time
years, yeah.
before it was actually written, certainly before it was finished. And you can see in it, we'll get to that, but you can see some evidence of that in the story about how this was an orally passed down thing until it was finally written. And it adds some richness to it. There is, I am convinced there is an actual historical event, but it also becomes this story about the event. And it's very rich because of that. And when Mary wants to say, a timeline on it, we know that it starts out saying in the time when the judges ruled. The time of the judges was the darkest time in the history of Israel. The lawlessness, and it says that each man did what was right in his own eyes, meaning people just did whatever they wanted to. They didn't consult God. They didn't care about the law or about God. They all looked out for themselves, and it sounds vaguely familiar. But this was a very, very dark time. And because they were so scattered, what am I trying to say? They were apart from each other. Their enemies came in often and would take all the food. They would wait until they could see the dust cloud from someone thrashing grain, and they'd ride in and take it all. And if they couldn't carry it, they'd burn what was left. It was a bad time. And it just says the time when the judges ruled. And we, as Western, Greek trained, where everything has to be logical, and we want to fit, and that's Mary. This week we wrestled over that all week, because you want to fit everything into a box. Go back to Genesis, and it says, in the beginning. And we want to get down and try and calculate
what year
that was. And the fact is, for this Jewish mind that it was written for, they didn't care about when with Genesis, they cared about who. And in this case, saying it was when the judges ruled, the idea is that's enough for you to know. They didn't even try. They could have cleared this exact time up with about 5 words.
In the time of which judge?
Exactly which judge. We think, because of the famine and some other things, that it probably happened around the time that Gideon, if you're familiar with the story of Gideon. And that was one of those times where they were coming in, their enemies were coming in and stealing all the food. And that's the best we can do. You know about when it is, but what you need to know about the time of the judges is this was a time that was a lawless, rough time in Jewish history, and people were, they were not doing good things. In fact, not only does it say that they did what was right in their own eyes, but in some other places it says they did evil in the sight of the Lord. So if that gives you the context for the story.
And where it is in the Bible, and I'm sure you guys have found it, it follows in the Bibles that we are using right after the book of Judges. But in
the Hebrew Bible, it's part of Jewish Bible. It's part of the writings, and so it comes in a different place. And it doesn't make one any better than the other. Frankly, it doesn't matter where it falls, but it is pretty conspicuous that they put it in a different place for a purpose.
And so I'm going to start, and we talked about there's so much in every sentence or in every verse, and you'll see that when I read verse 1, we have to stop and explain it. And so we're going to stop and explain some things, but then I thought we also don't want to lose just the story. So I think what we'll do is we'll do it verse by verse, but then read it again with the understanding and listen to it with the pieces that we put together. Is that a good way to say it?
Yep.
So, chapter 1 of Ruth, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man from Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons, went to reside in the land of Moab. That's just the first verse. So do you want to
Sure.
go ahead?
The famine in the land can mean a whole lot of things, and it can just as easily mean there was a lack of food because the Amalekites were swooping in on them. There is what we know is there's a lack of food. Food becomes very expensive. There's just not enough of it to go around. And so this man, a certain man from Bethlehem in Judah, and I hope you'll pardon me because getting into a lot of detail, but you'll understand so much more if we take the time to talk about some of these things that you would never know about Ruth, and they're really important. So first of all, Bethlehem means the city of food or the city of bread. It is a place that is rich with food, and they often have grain storehouses. There are places called Bethlehem all over. I mean, there are many of them. So when they recognize Bethlehem, Judah, it's because it's this Bethlehem and not some other Bethlehem. It also ties into the tribe of Judah, and we'll get to that. But a certain man, and we're beginning to, in the next few verses, you're going to see the evidence that this was told orally. A certain man. It's not really important. He's not a historical character. And you got to think about this being told at a festival or a gathering. They read it and teach it at the festival of Shavuot. So this is something, if you can picture it, someone telling the story. It's only 4 chapters. It sort of opens up for you a little bit.
And how about went to reside in the land?
Went to reside. The word there is one that we see translated as sojourn. And to be a sojourner is to go to a place to stay, but not to live permanently. You're just sort of passing through, or you know this is a temporary assignment for you. And they're told to be kind. The Jews are told, they're taught in the scriptures to be kind to sojourners. This is a difficult time of life, and they're not supposed to keep them pushed out to the outside. They're supposed to be kind to them. Well, they're going to go sojourn in the land of Moab. And the way Moab works, the Jordan River sort of runs north to south and splits this land into 2. And when the Jews were coming from Egypt, and they came up the east side, and they stayed over there for a long time. And that's the land of Moab. Moab was one of the sons of Lot. If you remember, Sodom, Gomorrah, Lot, Moab was one of the sons. And this area is named for him and his descendants. It is the land of Moab. And so the Jews come and live over there for a long, long time before it's finally time that they get led in to take the promised land. When that happens, 2 of the tribes, Asher and Gad, both decide, we like it over here. You guys, I tell you what, we'll help you conquer the promised land, but then we're coming back. And they got permission to do that. So while it's the land of Moab, it's also the land of Asher and Gad, and it's probably only been 80 years or so. So there are a lot of Jews. And contrary to what we're always told, like when we lived in Israel, the Jews and the Arabs weren't constantly fighting with each other. I mean, every now and then some knucklehead goes in and sets off a bomb. But frankly, on a day-to-day basis, they live with each other much better than you think. And in Moab, there were clans that lived right next to each other, and sometimes even sort of intermingled, So it's not as cut and dried as what you've been taught in most places. So while it's over in the land of Moab, and there's a negative connotation, like it's this pagan place, the tribes of Asher and Gad are both over there. So they're going to go because there is this lack of food. They're going to leave to go ride it out over on the other side of the Jordan. The question always comes up, did they do something wrong? People love to sit thousands of years later and judge people in the Bible. Well, they sinned when they went across the thing. They probably shouldn't have left the people. There's even some rabbinic rules that say unless one seah is sold, then that's a measure of wheat, like a couple of gallons. Unless one measure is sold for 2 seahs, you shouldn't leave your land. And they have rules for everything. But the point is, we can question, should they have stayed and stuck it out with their own people?
Probably.
That's a thing that theologians love to argue about. I'm not one of those, so we're not even going to get into it.
Verse 2, the man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they entered the land of Moab and settled there.
Now, we told you there's so much packed into this, and this, if it didn't add anything, I wouldn't bog down in the details, but they tell us some things here. First of all, these names are not real names. It's very common in this Hebrew culture to get nicknames, but also in telling these stories orally, they give them names that tell you something about the people. It's not really important. They're not like King David, where we come back to him, where he's important. They're just part of the story.
And Ruth's name was probably Ruth.
Ruth's name was, but probably.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
But the point is this, Elimelech means God is my king. Naomi, that word, that name, and it is also a name, but it means pleasant. But the 2 sons, this is where you really know these are nicknames, these are story names, because Mahlon means sickly, and Chilion means basically weak, wasting away. Frail. Nobody names their kid weak and sickly. Okay, I mean, they're pretty young. It's probably not time to saddle them with something like that. The point is, these are the names that are put in the story because it's an indicator of what part these boys, these sons, play in the story.
And like this is the first part of the story. They're introducing all the characters. We're going to tell you a story. We're setting the setting, and now we've introduced 4 characters.
And so it doesn't mean that it's a myth, because it's not. What it means is that this is the way they tell these stories, and it was more important to identify them this way than to try and go back and retain their real names. It's not as big a deal as that, but it does tell us about the story. Oh, I got to tell you the other thing. It says they were Ephraimites from Bethlehem. And that word is a word that means richness, fullness. The indication is they were probably wealthy people. We're coming from the town, the city of food, or the city of bread. And these are people who are wealthy and have abundance. In fact, that's really probably the best word meaning for Ephraimites is abundance. So we've identified what kind of family this is. These are people who are fairly well off in a land that is also fairly abundant. And now we've got this famine that hits, and it must have gotten pretty bad because even these people are looking to go move across the Jordan where there's more food.
Then Naomi's husband.
And I wonder if all of these names and their supposed meaning is all from the very beginning saying, hey guys, we're in a whole different level. This is just names on the physical earth, but we're really talking about the Messiah that's coming.
Oh, well, geez, I don't know. I mean, the names are in these old Jewish Hebrew histories. The names are interesting, but let's flash forward a little bit. There's a prophecy that says that Jesus will be called Emmanuel, and that word literally it means God with us. Well, it's not his name. And yet, if someone says, and it was Emmanuel, we all know who it is. This is a common characteristic. This is a thing that's done. So I would say don't get too hung up in it. Just be aware of the part that it plays in the story. But I'll give some thought to what you're saying. That's pretty deep, Gene, to hit me with. I'll think, I'll come back.
Then Naomi's husband Elimelech died, and she was left with her 2 sons, who took Moabite women as their wives, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. And after they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and without her husband.
So they went to sojourn. Elimelech dies. And, people make a lot, by the way, out of Elimelech. My God is my king. And then he turns around and leaves when there's a famine. And maybe there's supposed to be something about that in there. But he dies over in this foreign land, and they stay there for 10 years. That's a pretty long sojourn. They've kind of settled in. And the 2 sons take Moabite wives. And there's another thing, if you go read commentaries, people love to judge biblical characters, Here, let me point the finger at the wrong stuff they did. They weren't supposed to take Moabite wives. Well, yes and no. You probably would have been more traditional and more right for them to have found good Hebrew wives for these young Hebrew men. But it's not unheard of. And
there's a part in Deuteronomy that says these are the wives you can't take, and the Moabites are not listed among those that was forbidden.
The Moabite wives are not absolutely forbidden. I would kind of be careful if you read a commentary and they talk like that. But they did take Moabite wives instead of Hebrew wives, and to me it says they've sort of settled into this place. But here's the thing I want you to consider about the Moabite wives, and about whether or not they just should have gotten them good Hebrew wives. As we read this story, it unfolds in a way that could only have happened with Ruth being the wife and her being a foreigner. It doesn't happen. And so you've got to ask, did these people sin? Did they do wrong? Or were they part of God's plan to happen that way? Because it certainly, at the very least, you have to come to the conclusion that when it says God works all things together for good for those that love him and are called, that's what happened here. So I don't know how wrong or bad it was, but it works out pretty spectacularly well. Sometimes we get pushed, led to places because we see, looking back, God had a plan, and we don't recognize it at the time. But the other thing we have to get, Elimelech dies. Being an older woman without a husband is a difficult proposition. Her 2 sons' job in life is to take care of her. And it's a good system. It really is a good system. But then the 2 boys died. They've taken these Moabite wives. She's a stranger in a strange land, and both of the sons die. Now she is incredibly vulnerable. It's maybe not quite a death sentence, but it's not a recipe for a long, happy life. There's no one to take care of her. This is a desperate situation for a woman in this condition. Keep that in mind as we go on.
When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had attended to his people by providing them with food, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to leave the land of Moab. Accompanied by her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road leading back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you loving devotion as you have shown to your dead and to me. May the Lord enable each of you to find rest in the home of your new husband."
So, Naomi hears over in Moab, there's commerce. people travel back and forth. It's just the other side of the Jordan. And she hears that, let me read it this way, God had attended his people by providing them with food. The very strong implication is that she believes that God had caused the famine to begin with, or certainly allowed it to happen. And now he has come in and attended to his people by bringing the food back. And she says, well, it looks like a good time to go home. We came here to get away from the famine, and it looks like it's lifted. And she prepares to go, and her two daughter-in-laws with her, sits back on the road to Judah. Did I leave anything out? Go ahead.
Yeah, so then they're on their way, and the first thing Naomi says to the girls is, go back, each of you, to your mother's home.
Yeah, I don't think you read that
Yeah,
yet.
I did.
Did you? All right. Well, so the girls go with her, and they get part of the way, and I'm sure she probably is glad to have some company. I don't know. Maybe she just gets to thinking, they're going to go back over with me. It was a custom, not more than a custom, it's called levirate law or levirate marriage, that if a husband dies and he has a younger brother, the younger brother takes that woman as his wife. It's got to do with carrying on the lineage. And the firstborn son from that kind of marriage is the son of the older brother. That's just the way it works. It's not unique to the Jews. There are other cultures that do things that are pretty much the same. But she's headed back, and the two girls are with her, and maybe she just starts thinking, there's nothing for them over there. But she says, go back to your mother's house. Go back to the home of your mother. And that is a very unusual wording. Normally, in this culture, it's the father's house. And there's all sorts of debate on why it's the mother's house. And so this guy that Mary talked about that I consult a lot, I know he's right because he agrees with me, that probably the most likely thing is this is a story about women. And it's from a woman's point of view. And she goes back to her mother to receive the comfort. Now, these young widows will be taken back into their family home. They'll be treated as if they'd never been married, and very likely, especially if they're beautiful, isn't that sad? But they'll be married again. And if they're not, they'll have a place in that household for there on out. They'll be treated well, generally speaking. That's the theory. And so she says to them, go back to your mother's home. Go find the comfort of your mother and your house, because this is going to be a hard road we'd be going down.
And, and she ends up with saying there, may the Lord enable each of you to find rest in the home of your new husband. So as Scott said, the implication here was that they'd go back home and they would get to remarry.
Hold on, don't go any further.
Okay.
Because this is like one of the most important parts to me. Some of you have heard this before. A lot of you have not. It says, may the Lord show you loving devotion. In a lot of translations, it's loving kindness. Gene's shaking his head because he's heard me rant about this before. There is a Hebrew word that I believe is the most important word in the entire Old Testament, other than maybe Yahweh, God. And it's hesed, all right? You have to say it down from here, chesed. But hesed is this incredible, it's a concept. It's not a word that I can give you one English word to understand it. The closest we have in the New Testament, it is very much the parallel of the word grace. It is this undeserved kindness, and it's beyond kindness. It is kindness from someone sort of up above to someone who's lower in station maybe, but someone who has absolutely no possibility of paying back the kindness. It is often seen as a big, amazing, magnanimous kindness to someone, as I said, you get nothing out of it. There's no possibility. You don't even think, well, maybe someday they'll do a favor for me. Hesed is this beautiful concept word that is so rich, and it is the absolute picture of God's love and kindness to us. It entails devotion, it entails loyalty, it entails steadfastness, that it's not something that's going to just, be fickle and come and go away. It's a beautiful word. It shows up so many times in the Old Testament, and we don't know it because we have an English translation. But what she says is, may the Lord do hesed to you as you have shown your dead and to me. And this gesture that these girls have made of saying, Naomi, we're going with you. We're not going to go back to our family home. We're not going to go back to our old life. We're going with you. And she says, girls, that is a beautiful gesture. That is a kindness that I could not have even asked for. But you need to go home, and I'm gonna bless you. I'm gonna pray that God will do hesed to you the way you have done to the dead, to my sons, and to me. And this is one of those moments. This is a very, very human moment, but it also takes in this understanding of God's love for us through no action of our own, through nothing we could do to earn it. He bestows this hesed, and she's saying, you've mirrored that in the way you've treated me.
And as Scott says, the word hesed, this loving kindness or loving devotion, and it's sometimes even in the same translation, translated different when you read it. But when you read the Psalms, because when we did that thing on the Psalms and I started reading the Psalms last year, I ended up underlining every time I heard loving devotion or loving kindness. That concept is in Psalms so much.
Read Psalm 69 and look for a couple of places where he says your loving devotion, your loving kindness. That's hesed. It's all over the Old Testament. And as I said, it is one of my favorite words in the whole world. And I love words. This is a big word, and it is so important to getting the real meaning out of the Old Testament. To not recognize its presence leaves us lacking. Yes,
I think
sir.
that's also the basis of the human reaction by the mother and the sister and daughter-in-law, that they recognize who the power is, and that's God. And he creates the famine, he gets them out of the famine. There's no question it's a one-way street going from God to the people, and the people are reacting, and these three women appreciate the kindness, the chesed.
That's probably true. They certainly recognize the activity of God. And for the Moabite women, I can't speak to whether they've now believe Yahweh. Probably not, but they certainly recognize the goodness of God, whether they have the words for it or not. Yeah.
And she kissed them as they wept out loud and said, surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi replied, return home, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb to become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you wait for them to grow up? Would you refrain from having husbands? No, daughters. It grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Again they wept out loud, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her.
So that, again, she's talking about that levirate marriage. If Naomi had
Four sons.
Four sons, and two of them were teenagers or something, then it literally happened that these women would at least be betrothed and eventually become their wives. But Naomi is saying, look, this is it. I had two, they're gone. There's nothing for you here. I can't do anything for you. You need to go back to your people. And it's a strange thing that she says, go back to your gods. And that's another thing that people love to judge thousands of years later. But she's telling them, there's nothing in it for you to come with, nothing in it for you to come with me. Go home. And I think it's probably a nice thing, but there's a very human moment.
What I hear in the background, and maybe it's just my history, but it's one of the few instances where the biblical characters and the law, the physical Jewish law that has gone back all the way to Leviticus, seem to be in concert.
The intent of the law instead of the letter of the law. Yeah, you're right, Gene. I hadn't put it in those terms, but yes, there are things going on here that were what the law was made for, not as a cage to put people in, but as as this way of experiencing and passing on the hesed, the love that God shows. No, I agree with that.
Look, so remember, so Orpah has gone back, but Naomi has not. So we go to verse 5. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Follow her back home. But Ruth replied, do not urge me to leave you or to turn from following you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me, and ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped trying to persuade her.
So we got to go back. Let's go back to verse 13. I don't know if we read it, but I want you to look at verse 13 where Naomi is talking to them. And she says, no, my daughters, it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And you see her attitude on this is that for some reason, God has punished her, has seen fit to act against her, almost like he has a grudge. And for your sakes, because your life would have been a lot easier if all this hadn't happened, it grieves me for your sake. Well, I think it grieves her for her sake too, because she goes to the trouble of saying that the hand of God has, reached out against me. And it's no small thing. Naomi is human, and she's feeling put upon. I mean, she's feeling the weight of this, as we humans do. And I want you to see 14, because it's a verse that we can't just blow past. Again, they wept aloud, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. But this image of these three women on the road weeping, it's no small thing. I mean, if you want to understand human beings, if you want to see yourself, if we want to see ourselves, we have these moments. And Orpah is not doing anything wrong by leaving Naomi and going back. Ruth is doing something exceptional. And then comes this, series that starts at 16. And it's poetry. It is written in a way that you're supposed to see that. It is the meaning, but it's a beautiful thing. It's beautiful in the Hebrew. But don't urge me to leave you or to turn. Wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you live, I will live. And the idea of having someone who is that kind of a friend, or that kind of a daughter-in-law, to have a person in your life that says, I'm not leaving, wherever you go, I'll go. Your people will be my people, which they most decidedly have not been. They've been living in Moab. And your God will be my God. And that may be the significant thing. If you go read commentaries, you're going to read a whole bunch of stuff. But the fact is, Ruth has no doubt been exposed to their Jewish faith. And to take this step to say, your God will be my God. This is the issue when I wrote that page to you about the relationship between the Gentiles and the Jews. And they are linked, whether we like to think about it or not, whether we'd rather like to think about, we're the replacement for the Jews, etc. All through this history, they're linked. And she says, your God will be my God. And I taught this, we taught this once before, but I said in this, at some point we see that Ruth becomes a Jew. How did that happen? How was she able to do that? And she did it by saying so. It's as simple as that. They can make a whole bunch of rules about, you got to memorize this and you got to do that and you got to go through all of the...
Your mother has to be this.
Well, yeah, but that's born into it. They do take people in. But to become a proselyte and then eventually become a Jew. Ruth becomes a Jew at the moment she says, your God will be my God. She has taken on something. She has agreed to something. And you see her steadfastness. She means it. She means what she says. This is a beautiful passage. Where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me ever so severely if anything but death separates you and me. It's a beautiful passage.
Don't you pick up an undercurrent of baptism?
Well, there are foreshadowings.
Profession?
Yeah, profession of faith, that sort of thing.
I don't really care what the book says. I care where my heart is.
Where my heart is. And her heart is clearly steadfast. Yeah. And when she takes this on, we see later in this book, in this story, she says it, she means it.
And the other little thing, forgive me but this book is loaded. When the mother says, it grieves me very much for your sake.
Yeah.
I think that's the emphasis of that statement. It really does grab her, not for herself, that God may have turned his man together, but for your sake.
You're right, and though we are going to see that Naomi also grieves for her own sake. Naomi is human, but I think she's being very honest with these two young women that I really am sorry. I would love to keep you with me. I would love to have other sons. I'd like to keep you in the family. And your life just got much harder because for whatever reason, God turned his hand against me, not against you, but against me, but you suffered for it. And that does grieve me. Yeah, she is.
And at that point, her whole Jewish law was against her. She had no sons to go. She had no other kin to go. She was going to be by herself.
Yes.
So she had no other option.
She's in dire straits. And good for her for seeing that as nice as it would be to have those two women there to help her, to support her, she's not thinking only of herself.
So Naomi, I'm on verse 19. So Naomi and Ruth traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole city was stirred because of them. And the women of the city exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Do not call me Naomi," she replied. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has dealt quite bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? After all, the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me." So Naomi returned from the land of Moab with her daughter-in-law Ruth the Moabitess, and they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest.
So they show up back in Bethlehem, and it says that the whole town was amazed. And it's not, again, intended to mean every single individual, although it's possible. But in those times, there's no TV, there's no internet, and a new person coming to town is always an event. But this is Naomi. This is someone who her nickname, at least in the story, means pleasant. This is someone that people would like. And she's been gone, and now she's returned.
10 years.
Yeah, 10 years. Oh my gosh, it's Naomi come back. Look, and everybody turns out, and all the women, what does it say?
It says, and the women of the city exclaimed, can this be Naomi?
Can this be Naomi? Yeah.
So it's a coffee clutch of women
Yeah.
gossiping.
Yeah, and it's an event. It's a big deal. And then people like those kind of events. But Naomi says, don't call me Naomi anymore. Naomi means pleasant. Call me Mara. And Mara means bitter. And here's another example of these kinds of names that people, I won't give a movie reference. Let me bypass that. But it is this, what we see from this is that while Naomi felt for her daughter-in-laws, Naomi's feeling pretty bad for herself too. And don't call me Naomi anymore, call me Mara. And it's I want to see if we've gotten to it, but it says, first of all, that God turned his hand against me. And this is, we probably could spend more time talking about that. But she says, I went out full and I came back empty, right?
Verse 21.
The imagery of this, remember, Bethlehem is the city of food, richness, fullness. And Ephrathite means fullness. It means some people who are, have riches, they've got everything, the fullness. And she's got a husband and 2 sons. I went out full and I came back empty, and my life is bitter. I'm not pleasant anymore. I'm bitter. And is it a little, Mary said something about being a little dramatic. And I said, she was a wealthy woman with a husband and 2 sons, and she's come back a widow with nothing. I'm thinking that maybe drama is in order here. I understand her feeling bitter. And there are literally, again, people in these commentaries who want to say, if she really trusted in God, she wouldn't have been bitter. Okay, congrats if you can pull that off, right? We go through these times. We do. We're human. And yes, we trust God. I do. And yet there are times I wind up feeling sorry for myself, and I have to go back to these lessons. And sometimes I have to be taught the same lesson over and over again. Naomi is feeling the weight of this. She is bitter, and she tells them, don't even call me that name anymore. I don't want to hear it. Maybe she's wallowing a little bit, but she's new back to town. Where's she going to go? Where's she's going to stay? How's she going to get food? This is a very difficult thing. And Naomi, the beauty of this to me is that Naomi presents a human that I can relate to. This is real to me. Some of these things where people are in stories are icons, they're bigger than life. Naomi is me.
And I can see Naomi struggling with, where is my more abundant life? You've just taken everything. And so it's not bitter against Yahweh. It's bitter in her present state, physical state, the political world, the Jewish law. I don't think that necessarily wavers lack of commitment to Yahweh.
We have to keep in mind that this thing was told orally for 300 years.
And I was just going to say, to me, the richness of what I learned, my aha moment this week is the idea that this is a true story, but it was told for 300 years orally, and that vision of an older woman teaching the children this story and the children knowing this story. And Naomi wanted to be called Mara now. And the important things, it doesn't make the story any less true, but they highlight the things that were important.
It's a good way to put it.
And that all of a sudden Naomi is human, and Naomi, of course, would be bitter. And as Scott made me look at, she lost everything. Maybe it's dramatic to say you changed her name, but the idea that she had everything and now has nothing, and that she's back.
There is a festival sometimes they call it the festival of first fruits. It's called Shavuot. And it is at the beginning of the harvest, you go out and take the first fruits, the best of the first fruits, and you bring them to the temple. You sacrifice them to God. And Shavuot is one of those festivals that's ordained by God. They're told to honor Shavuot. And they arrive at the time of Shavuot. They arrive at the time of the barley harvest, at the beginning of the barley harvest. And so this story is read and taught at the time of Shavuot. Even now, even today in the synagogues, they bring out Ruth at this time.
Usually, and they say, usually the Shavuot is in April sometime. So the fact that this chapter, and there was no chapters and verses, but the fact that this chapter ends in, they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Everybody who was listening to this, all these Jewish people, would know the significance of arriving at the beginning of the barley harvest.
So we've got a couple of minutes, and if there's one thing I would like to sort of hopefully get you to think about on this, they had this tendency to think anytime something like bad happened to them, that it's a punishment. That, what did you do that God would do this to you? And we have developed this tendency to say God never corrects or punishes his people. We've gone the exact opposite with this. And so anytime something good happens, well, that thanks to God. And anytime something bad happens, well, that's just happenstance. And we don't necessarily look for any sort of correction coming from this God that we claim to believe in and follow. But there's a third piece here that I want you to consider. Just because something bad that we find unpleasant happens in our life doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bad thing. It certainly doesn't mean that it's a punishment, although there are times I can tell you I have been taught some very hard lessons. I'm absolutely convinced were corrections from God. I don't have any problem with that. But things happen in our life that seem unpleasant. They are unpleasant to us, and yet the idea of them being bad is probably not a conclusion to jump to all the time. I have said many times, Mary could recite it from memory, that the biggest train wrecks in my entire life have turned out, in retrospect, looking back, to be the exact amount of force that I needed to move me from where I was to where I needed to be. I see the hand of God in the biggest, ugliest train wrecks in my life. And one of them is, what resulted in Mary and I meeting and being where we are. And it was a train wreck. I'm not going to tell the story, but it was a train wreck. And yet I see that what I say about that amount of force, if it was any less force, if God pushed any less hard, I wouldn't have listened. I would not have moved. And if he had pushed any harder, it would have been cruel, because it was already, and it was unpleasant, and yet the outcome was decidedly good. And we see that, keep that in mind as we go through the rest of Ruth in the upcoming weeks, that the outcome of this very unpleasant beginning was something very, very good and unlooked for. In the story last time where we did Esther, I talked about that Hebrew word hafak. Hafak is this turnaround that you see that is inexplicable. It could only have happened with the hand of God. That's the inference. What we see in this story is also hafak. We see a turnaround from something that looks terrible, and as we go through the next chapters, you're going to see that it is this marvelous outcome. Does God work the bad things together for good, or is this something that this was the path he always had for us? I don't know. If you have an answer for that, email me. I would love to hear it. But the point is, when you're in the middle of these times, at least take a moment to reflect on this and the idea that something that's unpleasant in my life doesn't necessarily indicate it's something bad for me that God has allowed.
And we are at the end of our time, and the timing is perfect. It is our anniversary today.
It is.
So, and I asked him this morning, how many years is it? It's 23.
23 years.
Yes.
Pretty amazing. God, if we see anything in this, it's your hand on us. My prayer is that we, as we study it and understand your hand on these two women, that we see the parallel, we see the hesed, the grace, the gift that you bestow upon us that often we overlook. And I know, I say these things a lot when I talk to you, but what I would ask for is that vision, that understanding that at these times there is no possibility that you've abandoned us. And even when we feel sorry for ourselves, that joy comes in the morning, that we will see that opportunity if we seek you to feel your grace, to feel your hesed. Be with us this week. These ones we prayed for, Cheryl in particular, give her some relief, God. We ask for that. And be with us as we go, that we get a chance to bestow this hesed that you've shown us on others that you send to us. Amen.
Thank you, guys. You can turn on your mics.
Thank you.
I hope you guys all have a good week.
Happy anniversary.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
Do you have plans, Mary?
We're gonna try to go to Cheryl's for brunch, so it depends on if it's open, if she lets us in, and anybody who knows Cheryl, no, it's sort of a,
She might just look and say, "No, I don't want you in here today."
If she feels like it, right?
that's right, we'll see. We've got our fingers crossed. I did call, it was really funny, I called to see if they were gonna be open for brunch, and they say this thing like, well, of course we are, and I'm thinking, of course you are. Half the time you go by there, they're closed, but anyhow.
And Paula, I saw you come on late. It's good to see you.
And Cindy was on too.
Cindy, oh,
Yeah,
good,
yeah.
good.
There you go. Good
Bye,
guys.
everyone.
Have a good week, guys.
Have a good week.
Bye-bye.